go. Greetings and welcome to Market and Public Policy Opportunities, Business and Investor View into 2021. We're so glad that you can join us today as we really explore a wide range of issues with an incredible panel of speakers. One thing is clear, to many of us is that the COVID pandemic, the recession, concerns over racial injustice have laid bare the systemic inequities and structural racism that has long shaped our cities, neighborhoods, and the country. And successful strategies, initiatives, ventures, and policies of the 21st century and beyond must understand in which precise ways such challenges are systemic and structural. So these transformational solutions need to be incorporated in such a way that we are understanding the connection between all these issues and that our solutions are really bringing us to a new framework and a new set of business practices, investor and public policies that enable us to really create an equitable and sustainable economy. So our session today will cover a range of topics from the new frameworks to address structural racism, new investment strategies in housing and in community development, entrepreneurship, to the intersection of toxics and embodied carbon in building materials in the context of climate and environmental justice. So with that, next. Kristen, thank you. So just a little bit of background. The American Sustainable Business Council is a council of business organizations and companies that advocate for and advance public policies to create an equitable and sustainable economy. We operate at the national level, at the state level, and the local level, lifting up the kinds of solutions like the ones that you're going to hear today, as led by the companies and organizations that are really pioneering these efforts, right? And these are the companies, the responsible companies, sustainable companies, companies that understand that it's more than just about the single bottom line shareholder economy, understand the stakeholder or the larger frame around equitable and sustainable economy. And so collectively, we represent over 250,000 companies with all the organizational members and individual companies that are involved. And what we believe is it's crucial for businesses and investors to play a key role. Next. So the other frame that we want to offer up as you think about what we're covering today is that the opportunities to address these issues, can be found across every sector, right? In every campaign and every issue area that we might consider. So when you look at safer chemicals and supply chains, the relationship to what are sustainable practices? What are the policies that help to drive that? What are the impacts because of racial injustice? And what are the solutions that will both get us to the place of sort of safer chemicals and also growing local economies that allow these communities most impacted to flourish and create well-being across the board, right? So you can go, whether it's climate and energy, or regenerative agriculture, or infrastructure, or circular economy, and the like, right? Across all these issues are the opportunities that ASBC works in, but also the opportunity to look at how do we create change and how do we create it in a very systemic way, and how do we understand the relationship between all of these different issues and also these inherent structural problems that we need to address as well. Next. So, a bit of overview is I'm going to let some of the speakers tell you a bit more about their own stories, But right now, I'm going to turn to Valerie Redhorse Mole of Cherokee Ancestry and is the CFO of the East Bay Community Foundation. So Val, please.
Thank you so much, David. And I am just honored to be here. I'm honored to be a member of ASBC. And I'm just really thrilled to be together with these amazing panelists. So I am a CFO. I'm also an investment banker and an asset manager. And today, as we talk about climate solutions, I will focus on the framework, hopefully the cohesion of narrative, and really the power dynamics, because follow the money. You know, we have to think about how we're shifting capital if we're going to talk about solutions related to climate. So Christian, if I could have the next slide, please. I really want to talk about the narrative cohesion, especially as it relates to our climate justice and ultimately the power dynamics. You're going to hear some very specific examples of solutions from our other panelists, but what I want to focus on right now is how we think about money and the overall problem and solution. And my first sort of bold statement is I hear a lot of people talk about the intersection of climate and race, or climate and gender inequality, or climate and economic development and healthcare. And I would submit that it is not an intersection, it's a fusion. We can look at the problems historically as well as the solutions going forward, and they're all fused together. And what I would also submit is when you look at the solutions, you cannot ignore economic justice. If we think about shifting capital and shifting resources, ultimately those are fused together as well. So I will be addressing investment strategies and the narrative and power dynamic within those investment strategies to reach the proper climate solutions. When we talk about power dynamics, I want to really elevate the priorities of those most impacted, not the external parties. So historically, it's always been the needs of the investors and the funders who come first, and we're trying to shift that paradigm, obviously. I also want us to think about ownership and co-creation and belonging and bridge building. Again, no elevation of one entity over another. And then finally, I want us to think about process and how important process is, not just outcomes. One small example of that right now, just to give you a visual, we have a small community. It's a community of color located on the Eastern Seaboard. And recently the state and some other entities decided they were going to provide them with renewable energy and affordable renewable energy as a climate solution, which sounds great. However, it turns out that they ordered all of the parts for these, I believe they were windmills, from Europe, and big barges and boats have come and they're spilling diesel fuel and polluting the air while they offload all of this equipment. And it's not just a one-time event, it's sort of ongoing. And so those in the community are saying we should have been part of the process. It shouldn't just be an outcome-driven solution. So we're going to think about power dynamics in everything we talk about. Next slide, please, Christian. This is actually an illustration that I've borrowed from John Powell, who is an amazing leader of the Belonging Institute at Cal Berkeley. And this gives us an illustration of some of the concepts I'm talking about when we think of power dynamics. So I want you to think of a party, and the owner of the party owns the estate, and that owner of the party is creating the guest list, the food list, the menu, and the music. So we know what exclusion is. If we think of the party, exclusion is you're not invited to the party. However, let's think of words that we're currently using today. Inclusion simply means in this power dynamic, if it isn't changed, you're included in the owner's party. Words like tolerance, you're included in the party and you'll be tolerated over here in this quarter. Empowerment, you're included in the party and there's an owner who owns the party. However, you're going to be given the ability to choose a few of the food items. Those scenarios aren't really inclusion, they're not tolerant, and they're not empowerment because it still has a power dynamic that's off. When we talk about white supremacy, it makes many people nervous, but white supremacy is merely the acknowledgement that there has been one group of people in power making decisions for others. When we look at belonging, however, that is where everyone comes together. White people, people of color, women, different communities, and they get to make the decisions for the party that they're involved with. It'll be a collaborative effort, a co-creation of what food is being served, what music's being played, and what will actually happen at the party where there's this co-authorship. So that's the power dynamic I want us to think about as we think about climate solutions. It's a very important concept as we go forward with shifting capital and resources. Next slide, please. So follow the money. It's a simple concept, but here is where we are dramatically off in ever finding solutions that are meaningful and sustainable. Look at the statistics. 70% of the global population are people of color, and I believe 51% of that are women. And yet less than 1.3% of the world's assets and capital are managed by people of color and women. There is something wrong with that statistic. And so we have to, in finding climate solutions, we have to find the shift of capital in a way that is meaningful and sustainable. Next slide, please. I want you to think of an illustration with a roulette wheel. We all know that in roulette, there is a black square and a red square, and it is mathematical probability representative numbers that 50% of the time the ball falls on black and 50% of the time it falls on red. If we think about this illustration, and let's pretend we found out that there was something wrong with the wheel, and 90% of the time the ball was falling on the black square and only 10% of the time on the red. Well, there would be an outcry from the managers and the mechanics on the floor saying, oh my gosh, this wheel is broken. And they would probably do two things. One, they would go find the customers that had lost money or been cheated out of money, and they would try to make them whole. They would try to give them something to compensate. That's the equivalent to reparations, which is important. But imagine if they did that and never fixed the wheel, that would be ludicrous. So then they have to address fixing the wheel. Now imagine that the mechanics came to the managers of this casino and said, we have it fixed almost. We can now get it to where 70% of the time it's going in the black square, but 30% into the red. So that's much, much better. Well, you know what? The managers would say, I'm sorry, that's still broken and that's still unacceptable. And that's what we're seeing right now with some of the solutions around that power dynamic, just offering some things that are really not sustainable and not really thinking about the longevity of communities. So what might have to happen, we might have to take that broken table off the floor, put it in the back somewhere or throw it away and bring a new table, a new model, and maybe even a new game onto the floor to be played. And when we talk about that framework with our capital, our climate, our racial equity, our gender equity, we're actually thinking about not just power dynamics, but redefining risk and investments, redefining fiduciary responsibility, really looking at moving and shifting large amounts of capital in ways that are sustainable and significant. And we cannot stick with those broken models. In fact, John Powell's statement when he talks about white supremacy and racial inequity and racial injustice and gender inequity, he says, let's attack the systems, not the people. It has to be collaborative. Next slide, please. So in closing, I would say it is hard to shift capital and make huge changes globally, but it's not hard to do it in communities. And I believe wholeheartedly that we can really affect change that is meaningful and sustainable in communities by shifting capital and finding those solutions. You're going to hear about some of them from our upcoming panelists. But I would say that in closing, I want us all to understand that the motto of my community that I work with at the NESSBE Community Foundation is that it's not the role of external parties to create wealth, power, or voice, but it is for external parties to be allies and supporters, to shift and transform resources, elevate and amplify stories, and support those that are impacted the most. And what I believe can happen then is when we have that model community, we can replicate it globally and really see that sustainable change. So thank you for allowing me to be here today. I hope that you will enjoy the upcoming panelists as much as I do. And I just want to thank ASBC again for all the wonderful work you do. And I will hand it back to Christian.
Great. Thanks so much, Val. Great presentation. So with that, we're going to keep moving along now, and we'll take questions after all the presentations and open that up for dialogue. So next, I want to turn it over to April D. Simone, the founder of Designing the We, and a longtime ASBC board member. So April, please.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I'm really excited to have such a critical discussion with my fellow panelists, the incredible work that each of you are doing, and how do we really, as we say, actualize this rhetoric of social change. I founded Designing the We as a social impact design firm in 2015 as part of this larger dynamic of a combination of personal and professional experiences. I share this image with you because it isn't something that just came about from walking or experiencing in academia about lived experiences, but this is the home I grew up in. And it's deeply seated within me, trying to understand the systems that create sort of the disinvestment that happens in neighborhoods and that continues to happen all across this country. One of the impetuses of this work as a design practitioner with a background in planning and architecture is really looking at the understanding of ecologies and ecosystems, and why in 2021 we're still living the realities of the Whitney M. Young speech facets of a nation that really practices containment and clearance, and how come investment doesn't reach areas like the Bronx or Baltimore that predominantly are made up of communities of color. As Val had shared, our systems are not equipped and our tools are not equipped to handle the 21st century problems of these fusions that are taking place. We need new models, we need new tools, we need new frameworks that help us begin to understand this work. As part of Designing the We's platform, we really start to delve into the ecology of systems. We hear a lot in statistics around systemic change, systemic transformation, systemic racism, but when you try to engage people with this language, we sort of get lost in the weeds. And our work really tries to hone in and give this platform of understanding. A lot of our built environment, as we know, is comprised of a myriad of systems, land systems, food systems, that lead again into the entrenched disparities and inequities that we experience or know about day to day in the built environment. Our three cornerstones is really understanding how perceptions and mental models inform these bigger systems, how perceptions create power dynamics, as our previous guest informed us, that power dynamics, how do we begin to shift those power dynamics? And how do these power dynamics equate into policies, practices, and investments? We understand that the interplay of these three components are heavily weighed by system influencers. People like in nonprofit organizations and government positions, urban planners, architects, and these influencers bring certain perceptions, mental models that become reality or policies and practices within the built environment that inform what we call our determinants of health, whether it's in the built environment, economic, social context, education, health, food, the outputs that are manipulated by system influencers inform how we access systems. And what we try to do is really bring people into the picture to understand, how do you access your daily commitments that really center on things that meet your human need or scale your human condition, and which is at the core of racial inequity or the myriad of inequities that we see in the built environment. Our framework is simple. We look at reframing, redesigning, and reinvesting. Reframing dominant narratives that have perceptions of othering and, again, hierarchy of human value. And how do we once set a context, because so many of us are not informed of these deeper histories. We take the current moment and we use it as our framework, not understanding this is millennia in the making. And it's going to take deep reframing to understand, how do we move into a redesign phase of actualizing the outputs that are based on humanity and our human needs, particularly as we purport these lived conditions of and ideologies of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And how do we vet models that then open up the spigot of investment, that have listened to the community? The work that we're doing with ASBC, how do you open up spaces that community members usually never have access to, and really create these conditions of shift and paradigm understandings? And when we do this, our work really begins to take an ecological approach of thinking, that we, again, back to that word that values this fusion, that we can't look at just investing in a business, because the business operates within a larger ecology and ecosystem. And business will be directly connected to the ability to pay rents, land tenure models, healthy products, as David mentioned. So the way we use our three-pronged approach is really from an ecological perspective, and each brings a value. Reframing drives equity, redesigning is democracy-based, and reinvesting, again, is an ecological understanding of how I invest here creates a reverberating impact into larger spaces. Our framework has developed many tools, and the tools that we simply use are pedagogical development, because we don't have the understanding to shift paradigms. How do we translate that into the consulting arm? And then how do we create activations, again, through creating pipelines for investments, whether they be financial investments or even human capital investments of technical skills and support. One of the biggest tools that we have used and has been launched across this country is the Undesign the Red Line exhibition. It really is an understanding of how we undesign these metaphorical red lines and boundaries that we have mentally created in our mind from being socially conditioned within our built environment. What we have found as we launch this, it is a tool that really creates a space not about shaming or blaming, but that really brings in the we, this capital W, capital E, to understand, to curate a past to present understanding of what has happened in our built environment. How have we arrived at the systemic conditions that we're all looking at today? Launching this in the summer of 2015, some of the themes that we have looked at is, again, the social construct of race, as we know through people like Madison Grant, whose book, The Passing of the Great Race, purports the supremacy mentality of a supreme being and everything else is subhumanized. And that this has been inoculated in us because we see this with books like Today, Charles Murray and the Bell Curve, that there is this subclassification of humanization. And it is how we approach investment. It is how we approach this mindset of deserving or undeserving. We look at this and how this has led us into the first restrictive ordinances that have really impelled the understanding of hypersegregation, or these footprints in our society. This is Mayor Mahul, who passes the first racial ordinance in 1910, that blacks and whites shouldn't be mixing. And again, this is in a climate, and ironically, he's considered a progressive, where we're supposed to be reforming systems, but it's inoculated with these scientific racist ideologies that are stewarded by the power dynamic, who are put in positions of authority to spearhead the ideologies of again, democracy. And if you're making policy with these mental frameworks, it still carries on to today. This is Homer Hoyt, who becomes the chief economist of the Federal Housing Administration. In his dissertation in private practice, he takes on identifying what is detrimental to land values. And as you can see on the left of the screen that's highlighted, he lists undesirable ethnicities or elements that aren't something that we would like to have, because it's going to directly impact. Then we know the federal government passes and adopts this and codifies sort of the racial hierarchy of social groups. And when people see this, it really, again, reframes the different opportunities and how this translates to slum clearance and urban renewal and the advancing of restrictive deeds in places like Levittown, Long Island, and all of these publicly funded infrastructure projects that really are done to destroy and hurt. And before you know it, we have pandemics and uprisings in our community that tears the social fabrics. And we, instead of coming in and offering places to reframe and to heal, we're creating even more exploitative and traumatic conditions in community. And we see today in this concept as investors returning into communities. And this is a present day picture of Baltimore, Maryland. And as investment returns, what we're creating is a speculative frenzy that now creates the mist of the second redlining of the 21st century. So we need to understand and have frameworks that really contextualize how investment happens. We take this into projects like the Garden State Agri-Hood project that's based in Trenton, New Jersey. And the goal is to create contextualization, but what are the systems that we need to transform that's bringing a beloved community, not identified by boundaries, but identified by existing morals and ethics and understandings of how we want to have a different experience in the built environment. This is our, very complicated framework, but what we start with on the bottom is what are the macro systems? What are the systemic challenges? How do they impact the determinants of health? What is the participatory engagement process saying from community members that are anchoring these understandings of systems? And then from this, what shoots up out of the surface from these root connections of creating true systemic change? I'm going to just highlight one quick example. When we look at land tenure models in this country, we know what the history is, again, of the violent and forceful appropriations of land, the first form of redlining in this country through reservations, and how it has expanded to present day reality. And we know that that has created the hyper-segregated neighborhoods of today, the speculative real estates, and how that has played into the built environment as a direct correlation of the determinants of health. And we know that this has created a myriad of issues, and how when we connect it to land tenure models and REITs, it creates a different experience. Should I just keep going? I'm sorry, I may have spoken my time, but the collective ability of this work is really, again, creating systemic change and connecting investment and connecting thought leaders into a process that really is going to yield the just and inclusive built environment. Thank you.
Thank you, April. As you see, there's a lot more that can get covered on each of these topics here, and hopefully we'll get a chance to have some dialogue afterwards as well. So now it's my pleasure to turn to Juan Saldana, the principal in P3 Markets based in Chicago. Juan. Juan, we don't hear you.
I'm sorry, can everybody hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can everyone hear me and see me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen here. 1 second. Thank you so much for your patience. We'll get started all over again here, and we'll be up and running in a sec. Thank you so much for your patience here as I pull up my screen. All right, great. So first of all, I want to thank the ASBC for this amazing opportunity to talk about what we're doing on the ground. So we're not waiting. P3 Markets is not waiting for things to happen. We're sort of on the ground doing the work. Maybe it's because we just don't know any better, but we feel that we need to really make a mark today. This problem is a huge problem that we need to really shift the thinking. And so I just want to show you a little bit of what we're doing on the ground in Chicago. I'll talk a little bit about our why. Why do we exist? Because I ask myself this question every day and every morning, and so does my business partners. Are we agents of change, of the right change that's necessary to create impact in our communities? We believe in trust, passion, culture, and intentionality. I'll spare you some of the details there, but these are the biggest tenets of our company. We're partnership driven. We care about impact and focus. We put together our expertise, and we have some current projects that we're going to discuss now. So what is the big picture? When I think about real estate development, actually the built environment, I think about this particular question. I think that the idea of winning has to change. This was brought up by April, as also by Val. that we have to change the power dynamics, but we also have to change the mental models. Who's winning now? Well, the game is already won, right? The largest developers and REITs are actually now trying to develop in smaller communities. And so I think people need to start changing their thinking around what type of development they want to put together. And I think my theory is to have non-zero sum development and create shared wins. If we create shared wins in the future, we will have more people at the table participating in the upside. So how do we accomplish this goal? We need to align all opportunities and resources, and we need to maximize the win to benefit the community. This is going to be the wave of the future in real estate. When we look at the built environment, if we can actually all align to these ideas, we'll be in a better place. We need to wave a new reality where culture, plays, partnerships also create shared equity, where impact investments in real estate are a real thing, and where place is equal to environment, and commercial real estate developers make places. So it is up to the real estate world at a very small fraction of the whole big picture to really take an active role and try to do this in a very intentional way. Here are a couple of our projects that I just want to highlight, and some of our partnerships. Our partnerships, P3 Markets is public-private partnerships. We work with the public sector, private sector, and we put together deals. One of our partners is a habitat company that decided to make us a protege developer in Chicago. They're a phenomenal organization. I can't thank them enough. And also the Little Village Community Foundation for the trust in doing what we're doing today. Let's first start with Brownsville. Brownsville was a place, and just give you a little theme here. It was historical policies of the 50s and 60s changed the complete dynamic of what was once known as the Black metropolis. This is a picture of my business partner's dad in 1955. His father was a business owner, a builder there where we are doing our project. And the idea here is to make sure that we take something that is now blighted and repopulate the area and also add a tremendous value for the community. This is what we see today on 43rd Street and Perry, in the same location where that photo was taken. We took an approach to revitalize the entire community, starting with the first piece, which is phase one, which is an affordable housing project that has mixed income, mixed use, affordable and market rate units. We wanted to make sure we took care of the equitable transit-oriented development framework around building communities around ETODs. We wanted to make sure there was additional community retail. And here's the biggie, we're owners of the project as well. We had an MBE-led general contractor on the table. Pretty much minority businesses are involved complete throughout the phases of this project. The community was talked with at every stage of the process. They're deeply involved in it. They're basically our biggest champions. Here's what we hoped, and we got approved for this project with the City of Chicago Planning Commission, where they basically touted this project as being transformative, catalytic, adding tremendous value to the community. This is a brand new building in a blighted area that, because of historical disinvestment, now we have here as P3 put our stake in the ground. This is an ancillary view. We're taking advantage of the Green Line station, which is a transit node here on 43rd Street, again, right in the heart of Brownsville, known as Grand Boulevard. We're doing this phenomenal project that's going to create value and repopulate the area. Now let's go over to another area called Little Village. Little Village is home to the largest Mexican community in Chicago. There's a lot of things changing and evolving because of obviously the pandemic and some of the after effects of that happening. There was a commercial corridor study done back and completed in February of 2020 that basically says that we have to look at the corridor in 4 different ways: a gateway, an innovation hub, a question mark, which I think we have an answer for, and more of culture. So here's a building that we partnered up with the Little Village Community Foundation and the local chamber to put together and revitalize this very, very important piece. Again, there's a lot more innovation needed to create corridor revitalization here in the area. We took the building and we wanted to make sure that we include all of the parties. So we have a shared commercial kitchen that will be there to help a lot of the current businesses sort of react their businesses, reinvent and remodel their business models. We have a community cafe that's place-based where people come together. The whole project is called Esquina. We have a co-working office on the 2nd floor, artist safe space on the 3rd. It's a beautiful building built in 1888. It's very iconic, but all the ideas that April was talking about and that Val is talking about and that I'm talking about are coming together right now. So we're not talking about this in a theoretical, ephemeral way. We're talking about it. It's happening today. Here's a different view of the vertical accessibility, having the community cafe, business incubator kind of working together. So it's I like the visual of not the inclusionary, but basically getting everyone together into a belonging, a space of belonging. Here are some renditions and renderings. Obviously, the X is considered now a better word, not the intersection, but the fusion. Thank you, Val, for that wonderful nugget there. And here is the fusion of basically modern and traditional working together. And so what's up next for P3? In the corridor, we looked at the first phase of Site 1, as you can see here. We're going to build on a footprint of doing responsible development, adding value to the community through the built environment. We have now an infill office medical user that wants to be part of the story, that's going to be also adding value to what we're doing there on the corridor, creating the right appropriate amount of density to repopulate the area. We also created a new project called the Micro Retail Project that's also an equitable transit-oriented development. This is basically to democratize the value of location right next to the Green Line station. We were just recently added to the Chicago Consortium on opportunity zones, something that I think could be a very strong tool to basically make changes in these neighborhoods. Here's another viewpoint. We want to make sure that it's modern, but also has a little bit of the feel to get people together. So placemaking, again, is super important, and looking at the community structure, getting people to come together. Here's another view from the CTA Green Line station, looking into the plaza. So I am going to sort of finish off my part of the presentation. I know we had 9 minutes, and I would love to field questions at some point, but more importantly, what if we created some type of structure with stakeholders, potentially a donor advice fund, to help co-create new impact real estate developments, right? How will we do that? How do we create more working capital for community developers like myself and others that are doing phenomenal work throughout the country? How do we build community equity partnerships and qualified opportunity zones? We can do all of this if we're aligned to make sure that we're weaving a new reality. We're weaving a new reality where we have the stakeholders at the table. We can talk about program-related investments. So we can become a preferred developer for community partnerships, build up assets for communities as a partner. And this could be done all because there's a lot of studies and efforts going into opportunity zones. So that's all that I have for my presentation. I want to thank again, David Levine, the whole American Sustainable Business Council team, and all the leadership and thought leadership behind changing dynamic in the rhetoric around community wealth and everything that, you know, is very important to creating a new democracy and a new world that we need to really focus on today. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you, Juan. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Bill Walsh. And Bill is founder and strategic advisor of Healthy Building Network. So Bill, all yours.
Thanks, David, and thanks to these other great panelists. A bit from the communities that we're building to look at the materials that we build with and how we can align our climate and health justice goals by taking a specific look at embodied carbon in building materials. I'm going to set the context for how we're addressing climate change in our building products, outline some criteria for how we can align both climate justice and human health with our community development goals, and provide some examples where we're succeeding and falling short. And I always like to emphasize that as we build our communities, all the materials that we use come from someplace. They come from other communities. And many times these industrial communities are by design, to pick up on points that April made, they are designed through redlining to cluster people of color around heavy industry. And in the case in the Deep South, if you look at Louisiana, these huge petrochemical facilities are actually built on former plantations. So as we look at the power of place, as we look at how we make our materials and how we use them, it's important to connect the dots between the communities that we're trying to build and the communities that our material comes from. A little bit about HBN. Our mission is to advance human and environmental health by improving hazardous chemical transparency and inspiring product innovation in the building industry and others. And we do this through in-depth research on products from a life cycle perspective, taking into account not only building occupants, but the workers and the fence line communities that are engaged with these materials even before we put them in our buildings. To set some context, this is a global debate. Mary Robinson, who was the past president of Ireland and the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change in 2019, defined climate justice as shifting the discussion from greenhouse gases and melting ice caps into a civil rights movement with the people and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts at its heart. In the United States, the Biden administration, one of its first executive orders in January that addressed climate change, specifically included in that agenda delivering on environmental justice, and had a multi-point plan laid out on how its climate change efforts will also drive climate and environmental justice in the United States. And this was in turn built on the equitable and just climate platform that was signed by hundreds of environmental justice groups around the country, but also the largest environmental and progressive groups in the nation as well. And that platform noted that when addressing climate change, in light of what Mary Robinson said, we're not looking just at the statistics. We're looking at how local and national emissions of reductions of carbon and other forms of pollution can be achieved in tandem, and that the agenda must have foundation policies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and locally harmful air pollution. One of the specific points of concern that arises when we look at embodied carbon products is that so often these policies are not guaranteeing emissions reductions in environmental justice communities and can even allow increased emissions. And the reason for that is that if you look at American industry's orientation toward achieving climate neutrality in its products, you see that one of the main strategies is to buy what are called carbon offsets to cover the emissions that can't easily be eliminated. And we see this rising across a wide panoply of products. Here you have consumer personal care products advertised as carbon neutral, 100% neutral, directly because over 200,000 trees have been planted to offset the emissions. However, nothing is said about what it took to produce the product or the packaging, and whether there's any changes in the carbon and pollution footprint of those products. Here we have Shell Oil Company talking about carbon neutral petrochemical products. So products made from oil being carbon neutral, in part from reducing emissions, but also again, from planting trees in other locations. And in the building industry, we have companies advertising carbon neutral floors, again, without really clarifying how that carbon neutrality is achieved and what it means for the communities where these products are manufactured. So we have some basic criteria for how he can achieve climate justice with where the health and low carbon goals are aligned and not aligned. Let's take a look first at some of the unalignment. When there's a lack of supply chain transparency, we really can't tell what a company is doing in terms of achieving carbon neutrality. Oftentimes the carbon data are not accurate because they're aggregated industry-wide and not specific to a company. Health impacts are often not addressed. Again, planting trees does nothing to address the impacts of the communities that on the communities that are adjacent to your manufacturing facilities. Also, is there a specific plan when we talk about truly being inclusive and co-creating our plans? Is there a specific plan for addressing disproportionate impacts by the company that's reducing its carbon? And finally, are we overusing these offsets rather than making change to our actual industrial processes to reduce the reliance on fossil fuel inputs? So these healthy and low carbon goals will align when there's full transparency in the supply chain, so we can actually see what companies are doing, when there's reduced petrochemical emissions from these facilities into the communities that are adjacent to them, and when there are reduced petrochemical inputs, when we use less of the fossil fuels in the first place. Those are the criteria by which we can evaluate meaningful, low carbon goals that are aligned with environmental health and justice in our materials. So here's some examples of where we are succeeding in this effort. A new effort within the building community that's been endorsed by major architectural and building firms is a request for data on building materials, starting with embodied carbon. But it foresees asking for additional information on other chemical outputs into local manufacturing communities. And significantly, it does not give an automatic credit to a material that simply gets a low carbon score without taking into account how that was achieved. And so this is an example of a thoughtful process. I wouldn't say it was an inclusive process, although they did take input from some environmental groups that pushed the issue of environmental justice. But it was at least a thoughtful process to not look myopically at the carbon calculations without taking into account the other community impacts of manufacturing. So this is some progress. We've also seen that when we look at insulation, which is a huge issue for buildings, that if you look to on the left of the screen, you see some of the work that we've done to create a toxic hazard spectrum of how we would evaluate from red to green insulation products based on how healthy they are throughout their life cycle, including the emissions that are released during the manufacturing of these products. And you can see in the green zone are things like expanded cork insulation, fiberglass, both blown in and fiberglass bat, all are in the green zone from a health perspective. And on the right-hand side of the screen, this is an example of looking at the same products from a carbon perspective. This is not an HBN chart. This is done by experts in low carbon products. And you can see that actually the alignment is very close, that on the bottom in this particular scale, the green carbon absorbing products include things like cork that rate very healthy, and the carbon emitting high intensity carbon products, which are at the top of the chart on the right, include the foam based and polystyrene insulations, which correspond to the red lowest rated products from a hazards perspective on our charts. So this is to give you an example that we can truly align these two goals if we put our mind to it and are inclusive in thinking about and including the communities that are adjacent to our manufacturing facilities as we set our standards. And as to go back to something that Val had mentioned in her presentation, it really is about following the money and whether the manufacturing companies are investing their capital in improving the operations and healthfulness of their facilities, or whether they're sending that capital elsewhere to plant trees in a manner that gives them credit without actually taking responsibility and accountability in their own communities. So I want to just conclude by saying we can build healthy and sustainable communities with healthy and sustainable products, and by doing so, we will drive healthy and sustainable communities all the way through the supply chain and connect our communities and connect through our materials to achieve climate and environmental justice, both for all people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Kristen, back to the next slides, please. So, part of what we want to offer up is you can hear the range of perspectives that are here. And there's two projects that I want to point you in the direction of at the moment that ASBC undertook with scores and scores of business organizations, investors, and other advocates and the like over this last year. And one was a comprehensive report on creating an economic system that works for all. So as you can see from today's presentation, we're trying to cover the range of sectors and approaches to actually creating change. And this comprehensive report, over 100 pages, really outlines everything from taxing over to procurement, over to economic development, to other frames that would help us to understand what policies do we need to have in place at the federal level to create an equitable and sustainable economy. Likewise, as COVID hit and it was clear that we weren't going to get the kind of support from the federal government, that it was incumbent upon governors, mayors, and state legislators to actually step up alongside the many stakeholders within their geographies in order to create the kind of change that was necessary to take us from the midst of the COVID crisis onto a vision of what it could look like as we work to emerge from this. So from health considerations to transportation, education, climate and energy, and development in general. So again, another set of recommendations that are valuable at the state and local level. And then the third resource that I point your attention to is really this it's an advocacy guide for business leaders and the like about the importance of the role that they play and the importance of us showing up as responsible business owners and the like to be able to sort of articulate the solutions, the innovations, the role that business can play in creating a more responsible economy. And why we need this is both because we have the sets of solutions, as you could hear from the folks that are speaking today, but also because it provides that counterbalance. So we can no longer say that, it's what's good for the environment and good for our health versus what's good for business. Our role is to really articulate, what's good for business, the economy, yes, but for the environment, for our communities, for our health, for our well-being across the board. Next slide. So, again, what's key here from our perspective, these are a number of different ways that ASBC works with many of the folks on the presentations today, but also, the scores and scores and the thousands of other business and investor leaders and other stakeholders that we work with. But the key part for us is also the important role that policy really plays in helping to create the systemic change that we're talking about today. So as we look at the new administration and we look at what's going on in the states and localities, there are many opportunities for us to help drive some of the ideas that you heard being presented today, into being by really being able to shift some of the practices. So, whether you're thinking about the safer chemicals and the embodied carbon that Bill talks about, the idea of being able to sort of use procurement as a major tool to also not only hit the environmental and health aspects, but to also look towards procurement that prefers local economies, prefers BIPOC communities, prefers and all of these criteria as being crucial to be able to turn the economy and society around. We're going to see a number of attempts at infrastructure bills that are already being introduced at the federal level. So whether you look at the Thrive resolution that comes out of the Green New Deal, or the National Infrastructure Bank, or efforts around, broader infrastructure bills and water infrastructure and the like, ensuring that some of these criteria that we're talking about today are, embedded in those policies is going to be crucial for us to ensure and to support the efforts as we hear they're being talked about at the federal level in terms of the importance of addressing climate, of addressing race and equity, as we then do all the pieces of work across all issues that are so important. We made mention of opportunity zones today. Can we get back in there and, sort of hit a little bit of a redo on opportunity zones to get some of these key criteria that Val and April and Juan had talked about? How do we look at some of the broader frames to change the way that businesses and investing takes place, right? And so this importance of how the environmental, social, and governance criteria are built in, whether you look at general ESG criteria or the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, having transparent and criteria that we're accountable for on the broader level is crucial. So, and then you take the work even further, right? If we're really looking at race and equity as a key frame in order to move these policies, how do we ensure that our democracy is intact? So whether you look at the John Lewis Voting Rights Act or HR 1, which is, now just, passing through the House of Representatives. These are our opportunities to restructure our economy and restructure our democracy to make it work. So, with that, last slide, Christian. So here are some of the contact information for our speakers today, and we're going to open it up now for one more little round of a conversation with our folks here. Anyone jumping in, what do you think, for each of you, one of the top leverage points that you think that we have in order to create the type of shift that we want? If you were to see a policy or an action taking place, whether at the federal level or down to the local level or back out, what would that be? So why don't we start in reverse order? Just give us a minute on what you think that might be. So Bill, we'll hit you first.
Sure. Well, one reason I focused on the embodied carbon question is that we see legislation happening in many different states that will give a preference to products that have a low embodied carbon content or certification. And I think it's really critical that those any kind of incentive structure in procurement or in regulations that involves government spending does not accept low carbon products when that is achieved simply through offsetting your carbon emissions by planting trees, for example, in other communities. The point needs to be to align those carbon reduction goals with community development and community health. And that can really be done. And it's the difference between having large corporations invest in the communities that they are manufacturing in, or sending that money elsewhere just to get the credit. Your credit can look the same, your certification can look the same on the surface of it, but where that money goes really makes a big difference.
Great, thank you. Juan, quickly over to you. 1 quick minute.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Yeah, 1 quick minute to finish it off. I just want to, again, talk about make sure that we are impactful from the ground up. I really would like to hope that our stories are creating change into the future. We want to make sure that what we're trying to do is valuable for everybody. Thank you.
Great. And April.
I think what would be amazing, and I'd like to see in the policy arena, is really the RFPs and the procurement process incorporate language and vernacular that really sort of steers the conversations of those who are applying for them. So similar to what Bill was saying, like how do we begin to change from a governmental standpoint, sort of the reinforcement of the structure because of the language used in RFPs. So I think a policy initiative would really be, how do we look at policy itself and how can we make it malleable to reflect what needs to happen within the built environment?
Great, thank you. And Val.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm going to continue to focus on shifting our capital. And when we look at how inequitably it's being managed, I've actually created a model where I have what I call the quadruple bottom line. So I'm looking at funding diverse or women managers who also have a racial equity or lens in their strategies, and a community strategy, as well as an ESG climate strategy. And so we're looking at 4 layers of impact, and those are the funds that are getting the least amount of money. And I believe that any large cap bulge bracket bank or money manager who gets any sort of help from the federal government, and there's been a lot of bailouts, should be required to put a percentage of their assets when they fund into other funds with those types of managers. And there are models that we've seen, successful models where the government and the advocacy and policy have had to help us shift it because the volunteer model, the pretty please model, typically doesn't work.
Great. And why don't we then just say, thank you to each of you for your incredible presentations and being a part of this market and public policy opportunities the business and investor views into 2021 and beyond. So now I guess we'll just open it up to questions. So thank you all. Okay, Chris.
You're on mute, David.
Great. Well, okay, a couple of things we could to try and play with and edit there. And Christian, we can do that, right? I'm saying, I know Kathleen has done that editing before, right?
I think this shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
Well, you think? Oh.
Hey,
All right.
everyone,
be a
I just
problem.
want to apologize. I did have a wrap up kind of thought process to say, but I just got a really terrible call. I don't know if Christian would like me to add just a small blurb, but I really want to close my statement very well. I didn't have a chance to do that because as I was being asked to talk, I got to talk to my hospital.
All right. So
if you guys don't mind, I would like to kind of, redo that last piece if that's possible.
all right. Well, we'll let others go, and so then when I get any new information from the folks, but otherwise we'll just reconvene on the 26th and be able to take it from there.
Thank
Sounds
you.
good.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Kristen, can you retape, just the 1-minute synopsis from Juan
Okay.
and see if we could edit that in?
Thank you so much.
Okay, all yours, Juan.
Okay. So I think that it's very important that the policies of the Biden administration and going forward are really focused around shared wins. Looking at the real purpose of this work is to basically create and inspire measurable change. I like that all the different participants on this call were very adamant about changing the dynamic around wealth at the top and making sure that people from the communities are also winning going forward. So through a lot of different vehicles and all of the different parties involved and stakeholders, this could be corporations, foundations, large developers, local developers. I think it's all up to us to come together and look at a more a different system where it's not only about inclusion. Really, it's more about creating a larger belonging to the growth of our economy and of America. So what I like to say is that there's the tools already out there. It's aligning the tools, aligning the opportunities, and maximizing those benefits for the community in a way that we are champions of community equity. That is what we need to do. We need to really look at becoming champions of community equity because that is the way that we're going to create more sustainable structures in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Okay.